Following Jesus today. It seems harder and harder to define what a Christian is today, especially as it pertains to belonging to an institution. Someone described what sometimes is true, what begins as a movement, then becomes an institution, then becomes a racket. There's some of that going on in the name of Christ today. I've heard some say, I don't call myself a Christian, I call myself a follower of Jesus. That's getting closer to it. A few years back, Bill Moyers interviewed Wendell Berry on his Moyers and Company TV show. Wendell Berry, as you know, is the Kentucky writer and farmer that I greatly admire. Both Berry and Moyers grew up in Baptist churches. At one point in the interview, Moyers asked Berry if he still considered himself a Christian. This is what Berry said. I still consider myself a person who takes the Gospels very seriously. And I read in them and am sometimes shamed by them and sometimes utterly baffled by them. But there's a good bit of the gospel I do get, and I'm sticking to that. And I'm hanging in for the parts that I don't understand. And willing to endure the shame of falling short in the following of Him as a price of admission. I like that a lot. I think I could call myself a follower of Jesus, and I'm willing to bear the shame of falling short in the following of Him as a price of admission. When I was about 9 years old, I walked down the aisle of Ardmore Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, where my father was a minister of music, and announced my desire to be baptized as a follower of Jesus. When the day of baptism came, I remember going down into the water and up out of the water and feeling as though some brand new adventure had begun. A brand new life, though I had lived very little of the old one. In those days, Southern Baptists wanted children baptized young, before adolescence hit and the hormones kicked in, when real sinning could happen. Well, who was this Jesus I decided to follow that day? I could have no idea where it would take me. A few years ago, I received a note from a woman in Greensboro who now runs a community ministry agency. She said to me, I was baptized the same night you were at Ardmore Baptist. We didn't have a clue what we were doing, did we? I think I had some clue, but this following of Jesus is a road that cannot be plotted out in advance, and we cannot predict where it will take us. Follow me were Jesus' first words to those first disciples that day, Simon Peter and his brother Andrew. They were working class fishermen. Follow me, he said, and I will make you fishers of people. And immediately, the text says, they left their nets and followed him. Then he saw two other brothers, James and John, son of Zebedee, mending their nets in their boat along with their father. Follow me, he called, and immediately, they use the word again, that the text says they left their boat and their father. You wonder what in the world their father thought. What did Jesus mean when he said he would make us fishers for people? In Hebrew scriptures, the image of catching people was an image of judgment. The wicked were being caught in nets for destruction. Jesus reverses the image. Jesus' fishers are rescuers, saving people, catching them in nets as they are about to perish in the sea. Disciples are deliverers. As the old gospel hymn goes, rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful. Jesus will save. There are all kinds of ways to be overtaken by the swirling seas of life, all kinds of perishing, all kinds of dying. And Jesus calls us to brave the waves, to save the people in the flood. In Jesus' earthly ministry, there were all kinds of disciples and many ways of following him. Some left their homes, their jobs, their families, and followed him on the road. These were, of course, the 12. And there were women in that circle too, as Luke tells us. Luke mentions 3, Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had been cast, Joanna, who was the wife of Chusa, King Herod's steward. Now there must be some story in that. And Susanna. There were others that we could call residential members of the Jesus movement. People who stayed at home, but who helped Jesus all the ways they could from home. So Mary, Martha, Lazarus of Bethany are examples of that. And there were some like Nicodemus who did not follow immediately, but after a period of time did follow him. Not all people followed him immediately. Disciple in the Greek literally means learner, but it was more than a theoretical or academic kind of learning. That is an exchange of information. It required the engagement of the whole self, the body, the mind, the spirit. Dallas Willard, in his wonderful book called The Divine Conspiracy, says that a better word for disciple is apprentice. And an apprentice, he writes, is this: someone who has decided to be with another person under appropriate conditions in order to become capable of doing what that person does, or to become what that person is. I like the image of disciple as apprentice. It reminds me, first, who the master is, not I. It implies that there will be successes and failures along the way. It suggests that it will take some time. It implies that we are willing to be with Jesus over a period of time, to develop what Thomas à Kempis in his spiritual classic, The Imitation of Christ, calls a familiar friendship with Jesus. It is being with Jesus, again, over a substantial period of time. There are no crash courses on being a disciple. No 40 days to be a Christian kinds of books. We are, aren't we, so much in a hurry all the time for everything. But this takes time, and no one's timetable is the same. Maya Angelou, I've told you this story, says that when a person comes and announces, "I'm a Christian," she often answers, "Already?" There's a Zen Buddhist story about an eager young man who comes to the Zen master and says, "I'm ready for enlightenment. If I become your disciple, how long will it take to achieve it?" The old master shrugged and said, 10 years, give or take. The young man answered, "That's way too long. I need to move faster than that. What if I work extra hard to subdue the ego and let go of my attachments and learn all the spiritual exercises? How long will it take then?" The Zen master smiled and said, "In that case, we're looking at 20 to 30 years. We all need to allow time, and we need to allow God. That is, allow God to do God's holy work in us. This is not an Olympic sport. It is a journey, and we cannot do it on our own. Dallas Willard wrote of those appropriate conditions necessary to be an apprentice of Jesus. What are they? I would start here, dwelling in the words of Jesus and letting the words of Jesus dwell in us. Hearing His words and letting them dwell in us is so important as we are being formed as followers. That's why we're here today, isn't it? And every Sunday, to hear the words of Jesus and let them dwell in us. The other condition is belonging to a community of faith where a long conversation with Jesus has been going on. They're people who have been together over a long period of time, and they've been hearing Jesus' words and helping each other interpret them and live them out. Is there a book that we must master before we set out? Some rules we have to follow? When Sue and I talked about the sermon, she said, it's not about abiding by, as abiding by some set of rules. It's about abiding with. That is, with Jesus. As we set out on the road together, it's about relationship. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the brilliant young German theologian who was martyred and executed by Hitler for opposing him, wrote an important book called The Cost of Discipleship. And in it he says, when Jesus calls, it is, follow me, run along behind. Follow me, run along behind. That is all. There are beginning points for us all in becoming a follower of Jesus, but there are also other beginning points where it feels almost like starting over again. The disciples in the Gospels are like the Keystone Cops, bumbling along, 1 minute getting it, the other minute clueless. 1 minute courageous, the next minute the cowardly lion. But they don't give up because Jesus doesn't give up on them, on us. Some days we're like the clown car at the circus, but Jesus keeps sending us out. Jürgen Moltmann, one of the great theologians of our era, became a follower of Jesus as a German prisoner of war in a Scottish prisoner of war camp. He had been conscripted into Hitler's army. There, a Scottish chaplain gave him a New Testament with the Psalms, a little New Testament with the Psalms. When I was in Louisville, he came to preach at our church, and he brought that little Bible with him, told us the story, and then read the psalm that was so crucial to his survival. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. His journey with Jesus began in that prison with that New Testament. And yet in his autobiography, he also says this, I never decided for Christ once and for all, as is often demanded of us. I have decided again and again in specific terms for the discipleship of Christ when situations were serious and it was necessary. But I am certain, he adds, that there in 1945, in that Scottish prisoner of war camp, in the dark pit of my soul, Jesus sought and found me. I think there is for us all some beginning point, even if we can't pinpoint it. But we must decide every day, over and over again, to follow Jesus as life presents its choices to us. There was such a moment for me when I was a pastor in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm not sure I've ever told this story in a sermon. A black pastor friend, Michael Bell, had begun a protest outside an almost all-white elementary school to protest the de facto segregation in the Fort Worth public school system. Desegregation along racial lines, or segregation along racial lines. The school was right down the street from where I lived. The protest had gone on for several weeks with 30 or so black community leaders standing outside the school entrance every day as school began. As you might imagine, many people in the community were upset with the protest. One morning, just before I awakened, I heard a voice in a dream. The voice said, "Go join Michael." Was it God's voice? The voice of my conscience? Something I ate the night before? Who can know? So I got up, put my clothes on, and drove down the street and joined them. When Michael saw me coming up the street to join, he said with some surprise, "Steve, what are you doing here?" I replied, "A dream sent me. I'll explain later." And I did. Later in the afternoon, I got a call from a close friend in the church who was also the associate superintendent of the school system. The police had written down the numbers on my license plate and gotten my name and called Joe. And Joe called me and said, "Steve, what are you doing? What were you doing there?" "A dream," I said, and we talked. He was a kindred spirit who championed underserved students, but was surprised that I was there. I look back and say, I up and decided to follow Jesus again. I do not tell this story to be a hero of my own story. How many times have I not been aware or open to that voice? How many times have I heard the voice but been too cowardly to follow it? Many. The famous missionary E. Stanley Jones described this first turning of Jesus to follow him with these words: "We give as much of ourselves as we can to as much of Christ as we know." And then the marvelous daily adventure begins. We become able to give more and more of ourselves to Christ, and we discover more and more of Christ to give ourselves to. That's my story. It's an ongoing story, and as they say, I'm sticking to it, wherever it leads.